Imagine being stranded alone on a deserted island, a place once frequented by pirates and enemies. How long do you think you could survive? But the real question isn't just about survival. How long could you hold on to your sanity? And after all those years, would you ever want to return? Here's the true story of the man behind the tale most of us have read, or at least watched on screen. If not, we've probably heard about it somewhere. Alexander Selkirk, the real-life inspiration for Robinson Crusoe. After watching the video, don't forget to comment on the obvious differences between the true story and the famous book we all know. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, we'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. Enjoy! Alexander Selkirk was born in 1676, the seventh son of a humble shoemaker. His family lived a modest life in the village of Lower Largo, in Fife, Scotland. At the time, Scotland was independent from England, and tensions were building toward the Glorious Revolution of 1688, a rebellion that would lead to the overthrow of the king. So Alexander was born into chaos and grew up in its shadow. Given the turbulent environment, his family struggled to raise him properly. As a result, Alexander developed a rebellious nature. He was known to be combative, clashing with nearly everyone, including his own family. His father had hoped he'd follow in his footsteps and become a leatherworker or shoemaker. And as you'll hear later in the story, Alexander did end up dealing with leather, though in a very different way. As Alex's reputation in the village continued to worsen, things finally boiled over. One day, he behaved aggressively inside a church, leading to a scandal. He was brought before a church court, found guilty, and sentenced. Now, with trouble at his heels, Alex made what might have been one of the best decisions of his life. He signed on to a ship to escape the consequences. His goal? To become a privateer, a licensed pirate, which was a common practice at the time.
So, what exactly is privateering? It's a privilege granted to sailors during times of war, allowing them to attack and plunder the maritime trade of enemy nations. The goal was to weaken the enemy's economy and diminish their wealth. In essence, it gave pirates whose actions were normally illegal a kind of official license and legitimacy. With this permit, a country could assert naval dominance while simultaneously putting the unruly, often criminal types, to use in a way that benefited the state. It turned their tendency toward crime into a form of service. This kind of legal piracy suited Alex perfectly. Just 2 years earlier, the War of the Spanish Succession had broken out between England and France. It was the ideal time for privateers to grow rich by raiding enemy ships and serving their homeland. Alexander Selkirk began his privateering career at the age of 17. He took part in raids across the Mediterranean and the Caribbean, attacking and plundering Spanish and French ships. He seemed to enjoy life at sea. As a pirate, Alex leapt from one adventure to the next. After a full decade of roaming the oceans, in 1703, at the age of 27, he joined another privateering expedition under the command of English privateer William Dampier. Dampier had quite the resume. He had been the first Englishman to set foot on the southern coasts of Australia and had explored the northern shores of New Guinea. Compared to Alex, he was a highly experienced seafarer, and as the story unfolds, he would play a major role in shaping Alexander's fate.
On September 11, the ships St. George and Cinque Ports set sail from the town of Kinsale, Ireland. William Dampier took command of the St. George, while the Cinque Ports, whose captain would soon die, was handed over to a young sailor named Thomas Stradling, who was neither well-liked nor respected by the crew. Once again, Alexander Selkirk couldn't escape chaos. He was assigned to the second ship, the Cinque Ports, and served as a sailor. Being marooned on a deserted island was not an uncommon punishment for disobedient sailors at the time. History holds countless examples of such cases. Typically, the sailor would be left behind without provisions, equipment, or even proper clothing. In that sense, marooning was a slow, drawn-out death sentence, a delayed execution for thieves and rebels. Some sailors even preferred to be shot on the spot rather than suffer the prolonged agony of starvation and thirst. For those who chose to be left behind, a pistol was often provided, a grim tool for ending one's own suffering when survival became unbearable. The original captain of the Cinque Ports died midway through the journey. As a result, Alexander was promoted to first mate, while Stradling rose to the rank of captain. Perhaps this was the beginning of the tension between the two men. It soon became clear that Stradling was an incompetent commander. His strict discipline alienated him from his crew. Eventually, tensions rose to the brink of mutiny. It was only Dampier's intervention that kept things from exploding. After capturing a few small prizes, conflict simmered once more. A failed attack on the Spanish port of Santa Maria in Panama only deepened the problems. Following the failed raid, the Cinque Ports was in desperate need of repairs, so the ship broke off from the St. George and, in September, anchored at the Juan Fernandez Islands. There, the crew was given time to rest, while much-needed maintenance was carried out on the vessel.
However, after some time had passed and before the caulking of the ship was fully completed, Captain Stradling gave the order to set sail. Alex objected strongly. He insisted that the ship wasn't ready. Caulking is the process of sealing the gaps between wooden planks with pitch to make the vessel watertight. Alex repeatedly warned that the process hadn't been finished properly and that setting out to sea in that condition was dangerous. This disagreement created serious tension between Alex and Stradling. Alex claimed that sailing now would be a disaster and that the ship would surely sink. He even declared he'd rather stay alone on the island than risk his life on an unfit vessel. But Captain Stradling stood his ground and insisted they would sail. And of course, in the end, the captain's word prevailed. Alex, perhaps for the first time in his rebellious and hot-headed life, was completely right. Stradling left a small sea chest for him and departed the island with the ship and the crew. Alexander Selkirk was left entirely alone on that deserted island. His chest contained a few essential items: some clothes, a set of bedding, a musket with gunpowder and bullets, tobacco, an axe, a knife, a kettle, a Bible, a compass, some basic tools, and a few books. That was more or less all he had. In the island's tropical climate, Alex's clothes quickly wore out. But using a nail he shaped into a needle, he managed to sew new garments from goat hides. He was also able to start a fire by rubbing sticks together. Having spent much of his life at sea, he was resourceful enough to take care of himself at least for a while. He built himself a shelter using tree branches, twigs, and tall grass. But rats were a serious problem. They would steal his food and constantly disturb him. So he came up with a clever solution. He tamed and fed the island's wild cats. Not only did this keep the rats away, but it also gave him a sense of companionship. You might remember the Bible I mentioned earlier. That book played a crucial role in helping Alex preserve his sanity. In fact, for the rest of his life, he would never again be as devoted to his faith as he was during those long, lonely years on the island.
The island where Alexander Selkirk, known in Spanish lore as Robinson Crusoe, was stranded, had a crescent shape. Its western end featured a long, narrow peninsula, and mountains rose from its center. The dense forested areas provided Selkirk with wood, fresh spring water, and food from goats, seals, and sea lions. There were also wild plums, herbs, and turnips left behind by previous sailors who had temporarily used the island as a base. Throughout the 17th century, the island had served as a hideout for pirates and privateers. In the first few months of his stay, Alex believed that a passing ship would soon come and rescue him. However, he would have to wait over 4 years before speaking to another human being again. At first, life on the island was extremely difficult, but as months went by, he gradually adapted. In fact, if someone had told him the ship he refused to board had actually sunk, perhaps he would have felt more at peace with his decision. Yes, Alex had been right. The Cinque Ports sank near the coast of Isla Mapello. Most of the crew died, and those who survived, including Captain Stradling, were captured by the Spanish and imprisoned for piracy. Had Alex known this at the time, his solitude might have felt more bearable. As seasons turned into years, Alex became a true islander. Apart from nearly forgetting how to speak, he was physically in decent shape. He had settled into a routine. He had water, food, shelter, tools, and even clothing he made from goat hides, ironically fulfilling his father's wish that he work with leather. He was surviving, somehow. But Alexander Selkirk wasn't the first sailor to be marooned on that island. A few years before Alex's arrival, another pirate, Captain Woodes Rogers, had visited the same island with his crew. At one point, he had sent a man inland to hunt animals, but when a Spanish ship was spotted offshore, Rogers had no choice but to leave in a hurry, abandoning the man. Years later, Rogers returned to the island and noticed a signal fire burning. He wondered whether the man he had left behind could still be alive. When the ship anchored and the crew approached the shore, Rogers expected to find his long-lost sailor. Instead, he was greeted by a strange figure. A man clothed in animal skins, accompanied by goats. It was Alexander Selkirk. By then, Alex had almost completely forgotten how to speak. He struggled to express himself, but Rogers could see that the man desperately wanted to be rescued. Still, the captain wasn't entirely sure he could trust this wild-looking castaway.
Just as the captain was preparing to sail away and leave the man in goatskin clothing behind, someone stepped forward and vouched for him. This person convinced the captain that the wild-looking man could actually be of use to them. The man who vouched for Alex was none other than the captain of the other ship, from the very fleet they had once served in together, a man who had known Alex in the past. Fortunately, the experienced captain, William Dampier, recognized Alexander Selkirk. And just when everything seemed to be over for the man who had spent 4 long years alone and on the edge of losing his mind, Dampier made that crucial intervention I mentioned earlier in the story. Thanks to him, Alexander Selkirk was finally rescued after surviving completely alone on that deserted island for 4 years. Captain Woodes Rogers later published a book in 1712 in which he mentioned Alex. He described the man he found on the island as wearing goat skins, appearing wild, barely able to speak, yet still in excellent physical condition. Once Alex regained his ability to speak, he told the captain that over the years he had spotted several ships, but none had noticed his signal fires. He also recalled a terrifying moment when 2 ships did anchor near the island, but they turned out to be Spanish vessels. When Alex called out for help from a distance, they opened fire on him. He had no choice but to flee deep into the jungle. Thankfully, after all those years of isolation, his rescue had finally come.
With Alex now part of the crew, their privateering expeditions began to intensify. He was brought on board as the ship's second-in-command and proved to be extremely valuable. After several years at sea and countless spoils collected, Alex finally decided to return to land in 1711, receiving his share of the loot, 800 pounds, which would be worth roughly $200,000 today. After a life spent on the ocean, Alex used his earnings to return to England, where he lived in relative comfort for a few years. But after 6 peaceful years on land, he found that the quiet life simply didn't suit him. In 1717, he joined the Royal Navy as an officer. There too, he proved successful, rising through the ranks. But Alexander Selkirk, a man truly in love with the sea and chaos, would eventually meet his end at sea in 1721, after contracting yellow fever. According to historical records, in his final years, Alex often said that he longed to return to the deserted island that had once nearly driven him mad.
And that's the real story behind Robinson Crusoe, one of the most famous novels ever written, translated into over 10 languages and sold in the millions around the world. We hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below.